Hello and welcome to this presentation about the organ building business known as W. Denman Son of York. Let me begin by thanking John Scott Whiteley, President of the York and District Organists Association, for this opportunity to share some of my PhD research with you, and James Ratcliffe for kindly editing everything together. You are going to see photographs of numerous organs built by William Denman and his son John Doraldenman, and you will hear short pieces performed on 4 of the instruments that have survived in original or near original condition. I am grateful to the ministers and churchwardens of St Peter Kirkthorpe, All Saints Thirlby, St John the Evangelist Whitwell on the Hill, and Lidget Methodist Church in Acombe for allowing me to record their respective instruments. Some of you are no doubt well acquainted with the work of W. Denman Son already. For the benefit of anyone unfamiliar with this important provincial organ building business, I will adhere to a straightforward chronological structure and provide a general overview. For more information about W. Denman Son, or any of the other organ building businesses that operated in 19th century York, please visit yorkorganhistory.co.uk. Digital copies of my PhD thesis can be downloaded from there for free, and bound copies can be purchased through the online shop. William Denman was born in either late 1824 or early 1825 and baptised on Saturday the 29th of January 1825 at St John the Baptist, Scarborough, Nottinghamshire. As you can see from his family tree, William was the son of local weaver Charles Denman and a descendant of the ancient Denman family of West Retford. It would appear that William initially trained as a cabinet maker, but little is known about his early life. John Ward Knowles, one of 19th century York's foremost stained glass artists, recalled in 1924 that William Denman moved to York around 1844 or 1845. Although many of the dates recorded by Knowles in his antiquarian manuscripts are now known to be incorrect, the dates given in this instance seem logical. We know that William Denman married Mary Duckworth on Thursday the 13th of June 1850 at the ancient church of St Maurice next to Monk Bar, before moving into a house together. St Andrew's churchyard is given as the location of this house in the 1851 census, but no further details are listed. As you can see in this map from 1852, the redundant church of St Andrew, located between St Andrew Gate and Spen Lane, used to be surrounded by numerous properties, including some that were physically attached to the building, which was at the time being used as a Sunday school for girls and a day school for infants. It seems highly likely that William and Mary Denman lived in one of these houses throughout the 1850s, before moving to 35 Old Walk at some point before the 1861 census. William and Mary Denman's first child, Charles William Denman, was born in 1851, but sadly died in infancy. John Doraldenman was born in 1852. I won't say much about John at this stage, because his life will be discussed in detail later, and I must start talking about organ building. William Denman described himself as a woodcarver at the beginning of his time in York, but he appears to have been drawn towards organ building fairly quickly. At some point during the 1850s, Denman secured work with the local organ builder Robert Postle. John Ward Knowles recalled in 1924 that Denman was, quote, a man of very taciturn disposition. He would work most of the day without exchanging a word with his fellow workmen, but he was very observant of what was going on about him. Consequently, he acquired as much information about the construction of an organ as to enable him to set up business in that line, although ignorant of that craft before he entered Postle's works. Denman commenced business on his own account in December 1863, having allegedly gained, quote, many years' experience within the industry. Advertisements for Denman's new business appeared in the local press every week for the first 6 months of 1864. William Denman's first organ manufactory was located at what he described as 8 Chapterhouse Street. According to the RCHME's inventory of the historical monuments in the city of York, 8 Chapterhouse Street is the address of this building, the former rectory of Holy Trinity, Goodramgate. We are told that the rectors of Holy Trinity continued to use this building until it was sold in 1880. So where was Denman's first organ manufactory? I know that the organist Benjamin Shaw listed 8 Chapterhouse Street as his address during the 1850s. Indeed, it seems likely that William Denman purchased the property from Shaw, but I don't think that they were referring to the rectory itself. Perhaps Shaw and Denman's property was the mid-18th century outbuilding next to Chapterhouse Street, used today as a garage. If anyone watching is able to shed some light upon the matter, I would be most grateful. William Denman entered into the organ building world at a very interesting point in its history. Increased contact with mainland Europe, initially through the influence of musical tourists and the translation of foreign textbooks into English, prompted a re-evaluation of organ building in this country. Nicholas Thistlethwaite wrote in 1990 that, quote, "It is no exaggeration to suggest that between 1840 and 1870 English organ building was more directly influenced by the continent than at any other time between the 1660s and the 1950s. This interest in European practices eventually resulted in the so-called German system, a set of general principles that English organ builders were encouraged to follow by people such as Henry John Gauntlet and William Hill. I don't want to spend too long talking about the German system. You can read more about it in my PhD and numerous other books. But it is important to note that most mid-19th century organ builders adopted elements of this fashionable philosophy, and William Denman was no exception. The 1850s and 1860s were crucial years for the organ building industry in York, and for provincial organ builders in general. As you can see from this chart, 17 independent organ building businesses were established in York during the 19th century. 18th century York also possessed a thriving organ building industry, but that is a topic for another occasion. John Ward was the most influential organ builder in early 19th century York. During his 41-year career, Ward built or rebuilt over 80 instruments and dominated the local organ building industry until the arrival of Robert Postle. During his 47-year career, Postle built or rebuilt over 160 instruments, making him 19th century York's most prolific organ builder. The local organ building industry expanded dramatically during the middle years of the 19th century. John Hunton, Bartholomew Pexton, Richard William Chapman, Henry Whitehead, Joseph Bell and Pilcher Jones all attempted to establish themselves as organ builders in York, with varying degrees of success. The celebrated Hull firm of Forster and Andrews even maintained a branch in York for some time, but none of the local organ builders achieved anything like the success of Robert Postle until the arrival of Thomas Hopkins at the end of 1862 and William Denman at the end of 1863. At this point, I could easily digress into a discussion about T. Hopkins and Son, because I think that Thomas and Walter Hopkins produced some extremely fine instruments. But this presentation is about the similarly talented organ builders William and John Doraldenman. So I will now move on to talk about some of their best instruments. The organs that William Denman constructed at the beginning of his career, perhaps unsurprisingly, closely resemble those built by his former employer Robert Postle. Loosely based on the so-called German system, these early instruments were usually provided with well-developed great choruses, and all of them possessed C-compass keyboards and pedal boards. The great and swell divisions of every new instrument built by Denman during the 1860s were of comparable size, but the two divisions served quite different purposes. Denman typically provided his early instruments with just one pedal stop, either a Borden, violone, or grand open diapason, and most of his early swell divisions shared a remarkably similar tonal scheme, comprising, with minor variations, a Lieblich Borden, open diapason, dulciana, split bass and treble stop diapason, principal, 15th, and oboe. During the first year of his career, Denman constructed two one-manual organs for local customers. With no stops above 4-foot pitch, and most commencing at tenor C, These two instruments were evidently youthful experiments, but both were well received and provided Denman with, quote, lasting credit. The organ that Denman built for Duncan Place Masonic Hall was described as, quote, one of his early efforts as a master builder. After being enlarged by Denman's former employer, Robert Postel, in 1878, this instrument was replaced by Conacher in 1885. Its slightly smaller sister was used for many years by the Spiritualists in their Spen Lane building, but it was probably built for another location. If anyone watching has access to the York Spiritualist archives, I'd love to hear from you. Principal Pipe Organs removed this instrument from Spen Lane and transferred it to St Mary Bishop Hill Jr. in 1986. A new 15th replaced the original gamba, and a 3-rank mixture was created by adding 2 ranks on a clamp which can only be drawn together with the 15th. The instrument originally only possessed 18 pedal Borden pipes. Principal Pipe Organs took the opportunity in 1986 to provide extra pipe work for the full C to F1 compass, and architect Peter Marshall created a new colour scheme for the instrument. 3 of the 2 manual organs that William Denman constructed between 1865 and the end of 1869 have survived in near original condition. The wonderful instrument that Denman built for St Peter Kirkthorpe near Wakefield was described after its official opening on Sunday the 13th of August 1865 as, quote, a powerful instrument, much admired for its full, rich and mellow tone. Reporters for the Yorkshire Gazette praised its, quote, particularly fine open diapason, stop diapason and viol de gamba stops, and claimed that they had seldom heard their equal. As you can see, the great chorus at Kirkthorpe consists of open diapason, principal, 12th, 15th and 3-rank mixture. William Denman possibly intended to augment the great chorus further with both 16-foot and reed stops, as there are 2 blank slots on the stop jamb in appropriate places. The significantly quieter swell pipework is enclosed in 2 narrow swell boxes, either side of the west window, producing, quote, an arrangement which has a very pleasing and beautiful appearance. Both swell boxes are served by a single lever swell pedal located at the treble end of the pedal board. As you can see, the swell division contains a small chorus of open diapason, principal and 15th, plus a stop diapason, drawn separately as stop bass and stop treble, dulciana and cornopian. 2 blank slots are located at the top of the swell stop jamb, perhaps indicating that Denman had hoped to complete the division with some upper work or further reeds. In order to demonstrate the remarkably bold chorus that William Denman produced at Kirkthorpe, I chose to record Gustav Merkel's Prelude in G from Part 6 of the Organist's Quarterly Journal, a collection of original compositions, published in April 1870. This remarkable series was devised by Dr. William Spark of Leeds in 1868, seemingly as an unofficial musical companion to the Hill Gauntlet Revolution. Dr. Spark's preface to Part 1 of the series, published in January 1869, reveals that he wanted to encourage organists who had, in his words, become alienated from their true allegiance to the more solid and sublime inspirations of Bach, Handel and Mendelssohn, whose organ compositions require for their proper performance not only dignity of style, but manipulation of the highest order and, above all, a feeling heart and cultivated mind. Just as the so-called German system was Dr. Gauntlet's personal interpretation of both historic and contemporary German organ-building practices, the Organist's Quarterly Journal was Dr. Spark's attempt to create a native school of composition inspired by the particular values that he associated with both old and new German organ music. Dr. Spark appears to have particularly admired Gustav Merkel's compositions, even stating that, quote, during the present century, no composers have produced better organ music than Mendelssohn, Smart and Merkel. There is an elevation and purity of style in their works, and absence of meretricious taste and flimsy material, which at once mark their artistic superiority and their solid construction. Before we hear the short prelude in G, I would just like to read an extract from Dr. Sparks' tribute to Gustav Merkel, published after the latter's death in 1885. It was in 1870 when I visited Dresden, almost with the express purpose of asking Merkel to write some pieces for the Quarterly. I had previously seen some of his earlier works, to which my attention was directed by an experienced, clever organist in Hamburg. I accompanied Merkel to the grand old Catholic church of which he was so long organist, where he finally played some splendid compositions of Bach's, and his own, for over an hour, and afterwards, at his particular request, I played to him Smart's magnificent postlude in C, in the first part of the Quarterly Journal, and Sir Robert Stewart's Fantasia in D minor from the same number. Merkel seemed particularly pleased with both, and assured me that it was the first English organ music with which he was acquainted. He readily acquiesced to my request to write for the Quarterly, and the result was the publication of that Pastorale in G major in Part 3, which is admitted to be one of the most beautiful and effective organ works ever written, and was an especial favourite of the late Henry Smart. Since that time, we have kept up a pretty regular correspondence about other organ works, and it was only about 6 weeks since that I wrote to him and had an immediate reply respecting a new composition he said he would have ready in January. And it is indeed deeply to be regretted that his death at the comparatively early age of 58 has deprived the musical world of such an exceptionally talented organist and composer. The organ that Denman built for Great Snoring in 1867 is another fine example from this early period in his career. Described by Nicholas Thistlethwaite as distinctly Victorian, this instrument can be heard in a recording made by Jonathan Lilly in 2005 for the BIOS Historic Organ Sound Archive. William Denman built a small organ for Bricefield Methodist Church in West Yorkshire in 1867. This instrument was transferred to All Saints' Home on Spalding Moor in 1995, but its small size, including Tennessee swell and C to D1 pedalboard, precludes lengthy discussion. By the end of the 1860s, William Denman had several successes under his belt, but he had yet to secure any particularly substantial contracts in York itself. What he needed was some good publicity. When the opportunity to build a two-manual organ for Monk Bar United Methodist Free Church arose in 1868, Denman shrewdly offered to maintain it for 5 years and provide the services of his son John Doraldenman as organist for 1 year without any charge. The Monk Bar United Methodist Free Church was sold for £1,850 on Monday the 28th of May 1934. The building still exists, albeit in an altered form, but I don't know what happened to the organ. If anyone watching has any more information, or could perhaps supply some interior photographs, I would love to hear from you. William Denman was now recognised as, quote, an eminent organ builder of York, and his business expanded considerably during the 1870s. Between January 1870 and the end of 1879, Denman built or rebuilt at least 25 organs, and many of them were substantially bigger than anything that he had previously produced. Most of these instruments were tonally conservative, but a small number of new ranks gradually began to appear as the decade progressed, including 4-foot harmonic flute, 2-foot piccolo, and eventually undulating string stops. In order to keep up with demand, Denman moved his manufactory to 56 Skeldergate and advertised in June 1872 for metal and wood hands to supplement his workforce. Many of the instantly recognisable features associated with Denman organs began to appear shortly thereafter. All of the 2 and 3 manual consoles that Denman designed from the 1870s onwards were provided with these distinctive key cheeks. Rounded sharps similarly became a signature feature of instruments installed by Denman, although Forster and Andrews and Henry Willis are also known to have used this design. Finally, the brass nameplates that Denman had consistently produced since 1863 began to disappear during the late 1870s in favour of these more colourful versions. The oldest surviving Denman organ from the 1870s can be found at St Michael, Great Gidding. I understand that this instrument has recently been rebuilt, so the specification that you can see might not be up to date. Throughout the 1870s, many of the largest and most prestigious contracts for new organs in Northern England were awarded to London-based businesses, but provincial organ builders such as Denman were keen to prove that, quote, the public need not go to any distance from their own doors to obtain an organ of very first-rate excellence, both as to material and tone. When the opportunity arose to construct a new organ for St Mary Castlegate, York, in 1873, Denman pulled out all the stops, and part of his motivation for doing so is revealed in the following passage from a contemporary Yorkshire Gazette article. The builder is Mr Denman of this city, who has for several years past provided many churches and chapels with organs, but this is the first instrument that he has erected in this city. This latter fact, we understand, has been a stimulus to him to supply an organ of first-class materials and workmanship, and of adequate power and richness of tone, in order to give a decisive and practical answer to some churlish people who pretend to musical knowledge and taste, and who at every opportunity are asserting that a superior organ cannot be manufactured in York, and that other establishments in the country of acknowledged reputation must be consulted when a really good instrument is required. The Yorkshire Gazette article goes on to question how the Castlegate organ could have been, quote, built for the price, perhaps implying that William Denman had knowingly undervalued his instrument in order to secure the contract. 4 ranks of pipes appear to have been either incomplete or missing from the Castlegate organ at the time of its official opening on Thursday the 13th of February 1873, perhaps suggesting that Denman's relatively large specification was more idealistic than realistic. Despite paying £235 for their new organ, the rector and churchwardens of St Mary Castlegate were asked to pay a further £40, quote, when convenient, for some stops that were not included in the original specification. Although it is possible that the church authorities at Castlegate had requested further pipework, it seems likely that this extra expense was unsolicited, and that Denman had simply provided extra ranks in order to impress potential customers. The organ that Denman built for St Mary Castlegate was, quote, entirely reconstructed and enlarged by Abbott and Smith in 1892, then moved in 1959 to St Thomas Hyam, Norfolk, where it has since been significantly altered, so we cannot hear the original instrument today. But the following detailed assessment of its tonal qualities was fortunately published by the Yorkshire Gazette on Saturday the 15th of February 1873. It is no exaggeration to say that the quality of tone is excellent throughout. The diapasons are full and mellow, and the pedal organ particularly grand, the violoncello giving the peculiar effect of the instrument whose name it bears. The swell organ possesses wonderful power, considering the comparatively small number of stops which it contains. The crescendo effect is all that could be desired. The two reeds in the swell are excellent in tone, and give a very brilliant effect. Mr. Denman may be congratulated upon attaining such perfection in his reeds, which part of the organ is allowed to test more than any other the capability of the builder. The clarabelle on the great organ is a very good stop, and the horn diapason particularly rich, and contrasts with the distant and soft but clear sounds of the dulciana, whilst the flute is equal to any that we have ever heard. These stops together form an excellent choir organ, which for richness and clearness offer all that could be desired. The clarionet is a reed stop, giving a most clear and delicious quality of tone. The distinctive qualities of these stops afford to the organist means of producing a very great variety of effects, and this variety is further increased by the sub-octave coupler which Mr. Denman has added to this organ. We know that William Denman managed to secure at least one substantial contract because of the positive publicity that his, quote, bright and silvery instrument at Castlegate received. As a means of self-promotion, the Castlegate organ appears to have been successful, and Denman's reputation continued to grow throughout the 1870s. Although the Castlegate organ no longer exists in its original form, we can get some idea of how it might have sounded from the smaller instrument that Denman built for All Saints' Thirlby later in the same year. On Saturday the 26th of April 1873, the Yorkshire Gazette published an article containing the following description of the Thirlby organ. The quality and breadth of tone is rich and melodious, and altogether devoid of harshness. The flute harmonic possesses rich silvery piccolo sounds, and the diapasons are particularly rich and possess great quality and body. The oboe is very effective in the swell, and particularly devoid of coarseness so usual in reed stops. When the full power of the organ is used, the various stops blend well together, and the result is a rich, melodious and powerful tone, which has a grand effect in the body of the church. In order to demonstrate the, quote, rich silvery piccolo sounds of the great 4-foot harmonic flute, and the particularly devoid of coarseness swell oboe, I chose to record Philip Tietz's Pastoral in E-flat from Part 16 of the Organist Quarterly Journal, published in October 1872, a mere 6 months before the Denman organ at Thirlby was officially opened. This piece was written for a swell oboe and 8-foot harmonic flute, so I had to play the right-hand part down 1 octave when I recorded it. Unfortunately, on the day of my visit to Thirlby, bottom A of the great harmonic flute was not speaking, but I decided to stick with the composer's specific registration anyway. The organ that William Denman built for Salem Methodist Chapel, North Parade, Halifax, at the end of 1873, was one of his largest instruments to date. With 3 manuals, 33 stops, and 2,020 pipes, this organ represented a significant investment for the New Connection Methodist community in Halifax. According to a contemporary Yorkshire Gazette article, the organ committee from Salem purposefully visited York on Friday the 7th of March 1873 in order to, quote, test the merits of the new instrument lately built in the church of St Mary Castlegate by Mr Denman of Skeldergate. The organist highly approved of the instrument, and on returning to Halifax, he and the committee held a consultation as to the capacity and tone of the organs which had been played upon, and the result was that Mr Denman was engaged to provide the organ for Salem Chapel. William Denman must have been pleased when he discovered that the £440 order from Halifax had directly resulted from a favourable impression made by his magnum opus at St Mary Castlegate. Salem Chapel closed in 1964. If anyone watching knows what happened to its organ, I would love to hear from you. In 1875, William Denman built a rather handsome small organ for Lendal Congregational Chapel in York. I don't know what happened to this instrument, but the building has survived in an altered form and currently houses 2 restaurants. We will now look at 2 very different instruments constructed by William Denman in 1876. Firstly, here is the specification of Denman's 1 manual organ for St Mary, Full Sutton. This instrument remains in original condition and is a charming example of its type. Secondly, here is the specification that William Denman produced for Centenary Wesleyan Methodist Chapel on St Saviour Gate in York, now known as Central Methodist Church. Denman incorporated the chapel's 1841 John Brown of York organ into a new instrument that became, when finished, the largest in York with the exception of York Minster. The organ at Central Methodist Church still contains some pipework from its 1876 rebuild by Denman, notably both of its manual 16-foot stops. But significant alterations to this instrument have since been made by Brindley and Foster in 1913, Summers and Barnes in 1929, Wood Wordsworth and Co. in 1967, and more recently by Principal Pipe Organs. Fortunately, the following contemporary review of Denman's 1876 instrument has survived. The open diapasons of 16 and 8 feet tone are full, round, and of excellent tone quality, and, like the most of Mr Denman's diapason work, the tones of them travel with a fine mellow volume of sound that is exceedingly pleasant to the ear. The organ is well supplied with these fundamental stops, having a double open of 16 feet metal and another of the same size of wood, besides 3 or 4 others of 8 feet tone. The stop diapason is a nice fluty toned stop belonging to the old organ. The principals, 12ths, 15ths, and various rank mixtures are full and clear, but never harsh. A steady wind supply with a fine regulation measure is apparent, as none of the stops seem overblown. The scale of the instrument is 6 inches and a half to its open diapason. This large size ensures a great volume of sound without noise. Hence the chorus work of the organ is ponderous and full of dignified tone. The stops of the flute family are well chosen, and the quality of them, they are all new, is very fine. The flute harmonic is exceptionally clear and resonant in its articulation. The viol de gamba approaches as closely the stringed violin in tone as we could expect pipes to deliver such sounds. It is a remarkably nice voiced stop. The reed stops are plentifully distributed over the instrument, there being no less than 7 or 8, 2 of which are 16 feet long. The posaune on the manual of the great organ is one of the most powerful and finest voiced reeds we have heard of its kind. The contraffagotto, 16 feet, on the swell is a telling addition to that organ. The horn and oboe are a couple of good reed stops. The latter we liked much. There is a very brilliant clarion on the manual of this organ too. The Dulciana in the swell and the one in the choir, both old stops, have been the work of a good hand. The clarionet on the choir manual, we think, is not in keeping with most of the organ, with the solo stops especially. It is an old stop of the original instrument. The 16-feet tone trombone on the pedal organ is, we are told, the first great wood reed stop of its kind that has ever been made in this city, and it certainly will not disgrace its posterity, or they will prove fastidious to a high degree if we take such examples as we at present have as specimens of what is to come. Mr. Denman makes all his pipes, whether of flute work or reed, and also voices them all. It is seldom that an organ builder is successful in both branches of the art, but we think our fellow citizen has proved himself equal to the trial in most of the organs we have heard of his, and exceptionally so in the Centenary chapel organ. In 1879, William Denman built an organ for All Saints Babworth, Nottinghamshire, not far from his hometown. The appearance of a voix celeste in this instrument, and others built around the same time, indicates, at least to a certain extent, that William Denman was open to new ideas. The 1880s were incredibly important years for William Denman and his organ building business. On Saturday the 12th of August 1882, William Denman's son, John Doraldenman, married Mary Eliza Giles at the recently completed Victorian church of St Maurice. You may remember that William and Mary Denman's marriage had also taken place at St Maurice, but that was in the previous medieval building. I haven't said much about John Doraldenman's life so far, but it would be difficult to continue without doing so now. John joined the choir of York Minster at an early age, and began to receive organ lessons from Dr. Edwin George Monk, who is said to have quickly, quote, formed a high opinion of the musical talents of Mr. Denman. After further study with William Barnby, organist of the Wilberforce School for the Blind in York, John began to pursue a musical career during the late 1860s. I have already mentioned that John served as organist of Monkbar United Methodist Free Church in York for 1 year. John was only 16 years old at the time of this appointment, but he is said to have, quote, played in good style and discharged his duties very creditably. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, John gave concerts on numerous instruments built by his father, including Salem Methodist Chapel, Halifax, St Bartholomew, Tweedmouth, Melbourne Terrace Wesleyan Chapel, York, and Grange Road United Methodist Free Church in Middlesbrough. Local newspaper articles praised John for his, quote, skillful playing with dash and flourish, but his repertoire appears to have been somewhat limited. John seems to have been particularly fond of contemporary French and Belgian composers, including Batiste, Lefebvre Vely, Guillemot, and Lemons. At some point during the 1870s, John abandoned his music-making career, quote, much against the wishes of the late Dr. Monk, in order to work for his father as an organ builder. It would appear that John gradually relieved his father of many business responsibilities as the decade progressed. Although every surviving nameplate bears the inscription W. Denman, Organ Builder, York, numerous references to W. Denman and Son in newspaper articles and on company letterheads indicates that John Doraldenman was accepted as a partner in the family organ building business at some point before 1879. By the time John and Mary Eliza's only child Ethel Mary Catherine was born in 1883, her father was already, quote, putting most of his energy into W. Denman and Son. Fortunately, several instruments from the early 1880s have survived in largely original condition, so we can easily assess the extent to which John Doraldenman's increasing involvement with his father's business influenced the organs that were produced at this time. In 1882, the Denmans built this organ for St Cuthbert, Thetford, in Norfolk. The instrument was moved in 1910 to Thetford United Reformed Church, where it remains to this day. York's only church dedicated to St Cuthbert also received a new organ during the following year. This instrument was moved to ground level within the same church at the beginning of the 20th century, before being transferred in 1981 to the Church of the Holy Spirit in Ewloe, Wales. You can see the instrument in its current location here. In 1885, the Denmans built this rather handsome-looking instrument for St Michael le Belfry here in York. The Reverend Edmund Sardinson Carter, vicar of St Michael le Belfry at the time, was, in addition to being a talented cricketer, an excellent musician and a published composer. If you would like to find out more about Carter, my PhD appendices contain some further information. Also, Anthony Bradbury has written an interesting book entitled Reverend E.S. Carter, a Yorkshire Cricketing Cleric, for the Lives in Cricket series produced by the Association of Cricket Statisticians and Historians. As many of you will no doubt know, the St Michael le Belfry organ fell into disrepair at the end of the last century, and was not used at all from the year 2000 onwards. Through the vision and generous support of YDOA member Geoffrey Donald, a plan for the restoration and relocation of this instrument was formulated. In August 2019, the instrument was removed from St Michael le Belfry and transported to the workshop of Nicholson & Co. in Malvern for restoration. The organ was then reassembled at St Lawrence here in York last summer and used for the first time in November 2020. Restoring this instrument has clearly been a labour of love for Nicholson & Co., and I hope that everyone involved is proud of what they have accomplished. As you can see, this substantial Denman organ fits beautifully into its new home. Nicholson & Co. have recreated the organ's original 1885 specification, with the addition of some new pipework copied from surviving examples elsewhere. I had hoped to record the fanfare in D by Jacques-Nicolas Lemons at St Lawrence. We know that John Doraldenman played this piece at the opening of several Denman organs during the 1880s, but unfortunately the instrument at St Lawrence is still in its snagging phase, so permission was not granted on this occasion. Another instrument that has recently been brought back to life is this organ in Hartlepool. When W. Denman Son built a new organ for the Church of the Immaculate Conception in 1886, some older material from the previous instrument, including its rather lovely case, was retained. The organ was not used for several years, but is now speaking once again, and will hopefully give reliable service to its devoted congregation for years to come. The instrument that W. Denman Son built for St David Airmen was enlarged by Forster and Andrews in 1908, but its original voice was not significantly altered. In 1889, the Denmans built this small organ for St Stephen in the York suburb of Acomb. The organ was moved in 1951 to Holy Redeemer Boroughbridge Road, also in Acomb. The building that is now used as a church hall was at that time the main church building there. When George Pace designed a larger church just behind this building, the organ was once again moved and provided with a new case. In 1993, Principal Pipe Organs removed the instrument from Holy Redeemer and used it as the basis for a new organ at All Saints North Street in the centre of York itself. Just before the end of the 1880s, the Denmans built this small organ for St Paul Hensel, with an interesting case designed by Temple Moore. In the early 1890s, the Denmans came under the influence of progressive organ builder Robert Hope Jones. We know that William Denman examined the famous Hope Jones organ at Birkenhead in July 1891, but the date of their first encounter has not been recorded. Despite founding the Hope Jones Electric Organ Company Limited in 1892, Robert Hope Jones had, quote, neither the experience nor the staff to undertake all the work involved in the construction or rebuilding of an organ. Several organ builders, including W. Denman and Son, acted as subcontractors for Hope Jones during his early years, and many also sought permission to use his so-called Hope Jones system in their own instruments under license. At least 5 organs built or rebuilt by W. Denman and Son between 1892 and 1895 are known to have included aspects of the Hope Jones system, including St John the Baptist Aldford, Holy Trinity Scarborough, St John Birkenhead, St Peter and St Paul Ormskirk, and St Peter Eastgate in Lincoln. Before I discuss these instruments in detail, we need to briefly examine some of the organs that the Denmans built between 1890 and the start of their Hope Jones craze in 1892. Remarkably, all four of the instruments that W. Denman and Son built or rebuilt in 1890 are still playable, 2 with alterations and 2 without. The organ that the Denmans built for St John the Baptist Heelaw near Tadcaster has survived in original condition and is a worthy example of late Victorian organ building. The instrument that W. Denman and Son built for St Michael's Spirigate in York was transferred to All Saints Castleford in 1972 by J. W. Walker and Sons, and rebuilt to a scheme devised by local organ building enthusiast Michael Phipps. You can see the relocated organ and its current specification here. Interestingly, the previous 1876 instrument at All Saints Castleford had been built by none other than William Denman. At St John the Evangelist Whitwell on the Hill, the Denmans constructed a new organ with some pipework retained from the church's previous 1860 Willis instrument. John Camage of Beverley Minster opened this organ on Tuesday the 28th of October 1890 with the following programme: Handel's Overture to Samson, 2 pieces by Salome, the Toccata in G by Dubois, the Andante from Mendelssohn's Third Sonata, the Allegro from Widor's Fifth Symphony, a Prelude and Fugue in C by Bach, and Mendelssohn's Cornelius March. We will now hear the Andante from Mendelssohn's Third Sonata performed by me on the organ at Whitwell on the Hill. The final organ that W. Denman and Son completed in 1890 resides to this day at the St Saviour Gate Masonic Hall in York. Principal pipe organs rebuilt this instrument with tonal alterations in 1996. In 1891, the Denmans built this lovely little organ for Sowerby Methodist Church near Thirsk in North Yorkshire, and rebuilt with a beautiful mahogany console this instrument at St Mary Long Preston, also in North Yorkshire. W. Denman and Son added a 5-stop choir division to the Hill organ at St John the Baptist Aldford, Cheshire in 1892 with, quote, some of the advantages of the Hope Jones system of electric organ control. by using electric action, the Denmans were able to acknowledge, at least superficially, the influence of Hope Jones, but their work at Aldford was conventional in all other respects. The organ that the Denmans built for Holy Trinity Scarborough in 1892 incorporated an awful lot more of the Hope Jones system. Emboldened by their success with electric action at Aldford, the Denmans decided to adopt the following somewhat unusual design for Scarborough. The grate and pedal organs were bracketed on the wall at the west end, the swell organ being placed in the tower immediately behind. The choir organ, with one pedal stop, was bracketed underneath the northeast chancel arch, just over the heads of the choristers. The console was movable, being connected with the organ by 100 feet of cable. Robert Hope Jones publicly commended the organ layout at Scarborough, claiming that, quote, the result of putting in the organ had been the gain to the congregation of 40 sittings on the floor occupied by the old organ. Having been fitted with a console built by Hope Jones himself, the organ at Holy Trinity in Scarborough contained numerous mechanical innovations associated with the Hope Jones system, including a patent pneumatic starter, 16 couplers, some affected by double and some by second touch, stop keys, a stop switch by means of which the action of the stop keys may be suspended while a new registration is being prepared, suitable bass and special bass studs, and a sforzando pedal, which enabled organists to, quote, accentuate chords with forte set for first touch and fortissimo for second touch. The specification that the Denmans produced for their organ at Holy Trinity Scarborough may have, quote, anticipated Hope Jones's later tonal designs to a certain extent. Their provision of a heavy pressure tuba mirabilis and reliance upon 8-foot stops were clearly inspired by Hope Jones, but some of its characteristic features did not necessarily point in Hope Jones's direction, and appear to have emanated directly from William and John Doraldenman. The harmonic clarabelle stop, for example, is not generally found in Hope Jones organs, but an example was produced for Scarborough. The credit for making this rank, and suggesting that it should be of metal and harmonic, was given to the Denmans by none other than Hope Jones himself. Having been used for the first time on Sunday the 11th of December 1892, the Scarborough organ was formally opened by Arthur Mitchell on Friday the 10th of March 1893. The Reverend James Arthur Faithful, vicar of Holy Trinity at that time, is known to have described the, quote, touch and tone of his new organ as perfect, and claimed that, quote, musical connoisseurs and experts always express themselves as astonished and delighted with the instrument. Robert Hope Jones commended the Scarborough organ during a presentation to the Wakefield and District Organist Association in October 1893, claiming that its swell division had, quote, been described by many experts as astounding. Although the organ that W. Denman Son constructed for Scarborough was largely well received at the time of its official opening in March 1893, several deficiencies were quickly identified. Hope Jones is known to have admitted that the organ at Scarborough was, quote, not perhaps a perfect example, and its lack of upperwork was criticised by one commentator who felt that the size of the church required, quote, more power on the great organ. The professional relationship between Hope Jones and the Denmans was reinforced in 1893 with a somewhat personal commission. Although Norman and Beard were invited to supply several parts, Hope Jones principally entrusted the 1893 rebuilding of his Birkenhead organ to W. Denman Son. In 1894, Hope Jones and the Denmans collaborated on, quote, a large electric organ for St. Peter and St. Paul, Ormskirk. Although the Ormskirk instrument was provided with a more tonally conservative specification in comparison to its Scarborough counterpart, a heavy unison and sub-unison emphasis can still be detected. The provision of 3 8-foot open flutes, harmonic flute, doppelflute and clarabelle, and 2 string tone stops, gamba and solitional at Ormskirk, is certainly reminiscent of Hope Jones. Having been equipped with a console, coupler board and swell shutter mechanism manufactured by Hope Jones himself, the Ormskirk organ, unsurprisingly, featured a wide array of mechanical innovations at the time of its official opening by Arthur Mitchell of Scarborough on Friday the 27th of April 1894. Despite being rebuilt in 1897 and 3 times in the 20th century, the 62-stop organ at Ormskirk still retains a lot of Denman pipework. After Hope Jones and the Denmans collaborated on another organ for St Peter Eastgate, Lincoln in 1894, their short-lived professional relationship ended. It is interesting to note that the Scarborough, Birkenhead, Ormskirk and Lincoln organs are all said to have suffered from, quote, the mechanical unreliability that was to dog Hope Jones's instruments and for which he became notorious. William and John Doraldenman are likely to have been considerably embarrassed by the fact that Bishop and Son had to replace their Scarborough organ just 5 years after its installation and rebuild the Lincoln instrument only 6 years after its completion. None of the instruments built or rebuilt by W. Denman and Son after 1894 exhibit any features commonly associated with Robert Hope Jones, and their last 8 contracts all display a more conservative style of organ building. 3 organs from this final period have survived in largely original condition. Catton Hall in Derbyshire possesses a small octopod instrument with its hand-blowing mechanism still intact. Tarleton Methodist Church in Lancashire houses this handsome little instrument, and Lidgett Methodist Church in the York suburb of Acomb is home to the last surviving organ built by W. Denman and Son. When I visited this instrument to record William Wolstenholme's Meditation in C minor from 1897, I discovered that most of its pedal bourdon is not currently working, so the performance that you are about to hear has swell to pedal only. Tragically, John Doraldenman died of diphtheria on Thursday the 17th of February 1898 at the relatively young age of 46 and was buried 2 days later at York Cemetery. William Denman felt unable to continue working as an organ builder after the death of his son, so he sold number 56 Skeldergate, the workshop of W. Denman and Son, to Walter Hopkins and retired to Leeds, where he died on Thursday the 11th of December 1911. We know that William Denman is buried in grave number 341 in section A of Hare Hill Cemetery in Leeds, but I haven't been able to find his headstone. The central grave in this photograph is number 340, so we must assume that William Denman is buried somewhere nearby. I find the history of W. Denman Son particularly fascinating because it perfectly illustrates the evolution of provincial organ building in late 19th century England. William and John Doraldenman built such a wide variety of instruments, starting with some inspired by the German system and concluding with others inspired by the Hope-Jones system. You have now seen most of the surviving instruments built by W. Denman Son and heard 4 of them, but there is one more that I would like to mention. The organ currently residing at Princess Risborough Baptist Church is said to have been constructed by W. Denman Son around 1875 for a church in Yorkshire and brought to Princess Risborough in 1921, where it has subsequently been rebuilt and altered. If anyone watching knows where this instrument came from, please get in touch. My PhD may be finished, but I am still interested in further research. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me conclude by drawing your attention to some of our future events. On Saturday the 27th of February, John Scott Whiteley is going to interview Philip Moore about his compositions. And on Saturday the 20th of March, Josephine Peach will give a recital of piano music by organ composers. Both of these events will be broadcast at 7:30 p.m. on YouTube. Please consider subscribing to our channel or becoming a member of the York and District Organists Association. If you would like to find out more about W. Denman Son or any of the other organ builders that operated in 19th century York, please download a digital copy of my PhD thesis from yorkorganhistory.co.uk or purchase a bound copy from the online shop.